What's going on, everybody? Anthony Servino here with the Face Off Sports Network with my top starts and sits at the wide receiver position for NFL Week 12. But before we get into the action, let's recap Week 11. Told you to start Devontae Adams. He's the wide receiver 32 in PPR last week, 13.2 PPR points. That's a slight hit. Told you to start George Pickens, wide receiver 9, 16.4 PPR points. Another hit. And the big miss, in my opinion, Cedric Tillman, 7.7 PPR points to wide receiver 50. That's one start that we missed on. Now to my sits. Told you to sit CeeDee Lamb. Surprisingly, wide receiver 14 on a week, 18.6 PPR points. Didn't see that one coming with how poorly the Dallas Cowboys played offensively the week before, but yet CeeDee Lamb shows that he's a stud, gets it going. Brian Thomas Jr. told you to sit him. Slight miss, 13.6 PPR points, wide receiver 30. And I hit on Jaden Reed, told you to sit him, wide receiver 41 in a week, 9.8. We need to be better. I shoot for perfection. We have to put week 11 behind us. And we're going to start with my first week 12 start. That's going to be Terry McLaurin, coming off one of his worst games of the year to date. Only 2 PPR points. Caught one target for 10 yards. Struggled mightily against the Philadelphia Eagles. In fact, it was his worst outing since week 2. From weeks 3 to 11, he's had at least, or from weeks 3 to 10, double-digit PPR points every single game. Consistent, outstanding, but he hit a brick wall facing a really tough and ascending Eagles secondary. Well, he's going to look to bounce back. He gets the Dallas Cowboys. They're middle of the pack, but we know we can beat this defense. They give up a ton of production to perimeter wide receivers. And although on paper it looked like they stymied Nico Collins in his return, remember that first drive, Nico Collins had a 74-yard touchdown called back thanks to a Laramie Tunsil hold. There was a lot of meat on that bone that was taken away in one play. But McLaurin, we know he's terrific. He's getting 22% of his team targets. He's being targeted on 20% of the routes he is running with a 14.3-yard average depth of target. That's 89th percentile amongst wide receivers. He's also getting 42.1% of his team's air yards. When it comes to targets, he only had 2 targets last week. No wonder why Washington lost this game. They don't have a ton of explosive weapons, but Terry McLaurin is surely one of them. They did not lean on him. Volume has been a concern. Less than 3 targets, 2 out of his past 3 games. But even when he only had 3 targets against the Giants a few weeks ago, he still managed 2 touchdowns. He caught his only 2 receptions that day were for touchdowns, only went for 19 yards. So we know what Terry McLaurin can bring to the table. They just need to use him a little bit more effectively. And again, I expect that to be the case this week against the reeling Dallas Cowboys and a suspect defense that normally struggles anyway to stop wide receivers. But it just looks like this team overall, once they get into a deficit, they start packing it in. And normally Terry McLaurin does show up against the NFC East opponents. That includes the Dallas Cowboys especially. He's had a few pop games, notably his last one out, 6 for 56, quality PPR day, 4 for 50. He's at 374 and a touchdown. So some solid outings against Dallas. But this is going to be really the first one with Jaden Daniels, with Cliff Kingsbury calling plays. So we are starting Terry McLaurin this week. Our next start, Marvin Harrison Jr. Now, we know Marvin's been extremely frustrating, especially from weeks 5 to 9. Some really tough matchups: San Francisco, Green Bay, Chargers, Miami, the Bears, the Jets. Some of the toughest matchups you can face. But Marvin did manage to turn it on in 2 out of his past 3 games, one of which against Miami, and that secondary led by Jalen Ramsey. Another one against the Jets, and that secondary with Sauce Gardner. He goes for at least 16.4 PPR points, finds the end zone in both of them. In fact, against Miami, he went for 111 yards. Now, the Bears, which is sandwiched in the middle, number one defense against enemy wide receivers, he only caught 2 for 34 of his 5 targets, only 5.4 PPR points. But again, the fact that he's popped in a few of these really tough matchups shows us that not only is his rapport with Kyler ascending, but he's also, as advertised, sometimes it takes rookies a little bit longer to get going. But coming out of this bye, we know Marvin has one of the best matchup stretches for any wide receiver, and it begins this week with the Seattle Seahawks. Now, let's face it, Marvin doesn't see a ton of volume, but he doesn't need a lot to get going. Some of the busiest games he's had this year, he's had fewer than 6 targets. So it doesn't take a lot for Marvin Harrison Jr. to put up immense fantasy production. And even though this is the Cardinals, they emphasize the run. Harrison is still being targeted on 22.9% of the routes he is running, and he's still getting 22.2% of his team's targets. We talked about Seattle and this secondary, which sometimes plays well. We just saw them. They were gashed last week by Juwan Jennings. They were gashed the week before that by Demarcus Robinson. Both these receivers over 25 PPR points. You know, in fact, going back to week 5, 4 different wide receiver ones were 4 different wide receivers that led their team in fantasy points for the week, went for over 20. Every single one of them went for at least 18. We even saw Cooper Kupp in that matchup in week 9 go for 21 himself. So there are spots against the Seahawks where you could see multiple receivers go off against his secondary. I think this is a great spot coming off the bye for Marvin Harrison to potentially have one of his most productive outings of the year. Our final start, I absolutely love Josh Downs. Josh Downs has proven 2 things this year. He's quarterback proof, he's Flacco proof, he's Richardson proof. He's also fairly matchup proof. He's delivered double-digit PPR points in every single game since week 4. Remember, week 3 was the first game coming off injury. Doesn't really do much. But since then, the Miami Dolphins were the only team he's failed to score in the double digits. Even in his past 2 games against the Buffalo and the Jets, Jets number 2 against wide receivers, Buffalo number 9, he goes for 14 and 19. He is getting targets. Now, oddly enough, only 5 targets last week against the Jets, still manages 5 for 84 and a touchdown, but that 5 target total, his fewest since week 7. In the other recent game with Anthony Richardson back in week 9, week 8 against the Texans, he still pulled down 4 of 9 targets for 109 yards and a touchdown. So we know that Anthony Richardson is still going to prioritize Josh Downs. In fact, Josh Downs, you can make the case he is operating as the number 1 wide receiver on his football team, even ahead of Michael Pittman. I'm all in on Josh Downs. He's being targeted on over 25% of the routes he is running and still getting 22% of his team targets. I will take that volume any day. He gets a really nice matchup against the Detroit Lions. And I get it. The Detroit Lions, they're terrible against the pass on paper. Can they bring a pass rush that potentially stymie Anthony Richardson? Yes. Does that worry me a little bit? Yes. But this matchup is way too good to fade somebody like Josh Downs, who's performed in even the toughest of matchups. Now, Detroit, they don't give up a ton, but in the past 2 games, 13.6 to Brian Robinson. That's at least a high floor against Mac Jones and the Jags. Week before that, Mechie goes for 18.4. There was no Nico Collins in that game, and CJ Stroud didn't play his best football. They managed to, contain Green Bay Packers receivers, but still, Jaden Reed goes for 16.3. So I expect at the worst a high floor from Josh Downs. Now, remember, if you like content like this, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, the alert icon, so you can be notified anytime we drop content like this or when we go live to answer your questions, which is legitimately almost every single day of the week. If you have start-sit questions, trade questions, waiver wire questions, ask them in the comment section below. One of us will get back to you as soon as we can. Now, let's go to my sits. The first one is Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton, let's be real, he has been on a tear in each of the past 4 games, at least 14.8 PPR points, and that's his low. 3 of those games over 19, including 1 game in the 20s. He is getting volume, at least 8 targets in every one of those games, 3 of which over 9, 2 of those in a double digits. So there's a lot of good here. But why are we sitting Courtland Sutton? The matchup. The Raiders don't do a lot of good things, folks. But somehow, the Las Vegas Raiders are excellent against wide receivers. They are the 6th best team against enemy wideouts. Maybe it's because they're so poor against the run. Maybe it's because they're so poor against tight ends. But regardless, their defense is stymieing wide receivers. And in fact, the 2 games they played last year, in 2024, which was earlier this year, and then at the end of last year, Courtland Sutton didn't get much going, under 32 yards receiving without a touchdown in both of those games. This is a pure matchup, Sid. I get that if you're in a bind, there's a lot of bye weeks, and you need to start Courtland Sutton, you have to do it. But I am personally thinking he's a sit this week. The Denver Broncos are probably going to run the football and play really good defense, and that is going to be enough to shut down this Raiders team, enough to where I don't think Bo Nix is going to have to drop back and target Courtland Sutton at the rate he is being targeted. So we are sitting Courtland Sutton this week. And again, if you have to start him because of bye weeks, I would temper expectations. My next sit is Tank Dell. Tank Dell had a few nice games without Nico Collins, but now that Nico Collins is back, I think Tank Dell kind of regresses back into that number 2 role we've seen him, or even number 3 when Diggs was here. Tank Dell in back-to-back games under 9.8 PPR points. That 9.8 comes last week with Nico back. Now, in 3 straight games, at least 7 targets. 2 of those games, he's had 9. But those 7 targets came last week, again, with Nico Collins back. The volume he was seeing without Nico, and there was a stretch where he had at least 9 targets in a few games, it's just not going to happen. Nico Collins is going to take over the number 1 wide receiver role. He's a true alpha receiver in the NFL. You can make a case he's a top 5 fantasy receiver going into next season when healthy. Tank Dell's going to still make plays. He's still going to have those spike games. But with Nico back, it is going to be really hard to predict when they come. And quite frankly, I'm not in love with this matchup against the Tennessee Titans. The Tennessee Titans are playing outstanding defense when it comes to defending the pass this season. And this could be a nice spot for this Tennessee defense to play well. Houston right now, they're running the ball outstanding, but CJ Stroud, he looks off rhythm. And if he doesn't get on rhythm early, he can be thrown off. And this could be a Big Joe Mixon game. And this could be a nice spot for Tennessee to potentially give Houston some fits. But if you look at Tennessee, in 3 out of their past 4 games, they've given up under 10.5 PPR points to the team's leading receiver. They gave up 15.1 to Addison last week. They shut down Jefferson to 14.1, one of his best outings, one of his worst outings of the year. I'm extremely hesitant starting Tank Dell this week because if any receiver goes off against Tennessee, it's more than likely going to be Nico Collins. Let's start winding down. And the final sit for today is going to be Jakobi Meyers. Jakobi Meyers, folks, I don't trust anything happening with that Raiders offense right now. The running back room is in flux. The wide receiver room, yeah, in theory, Jakobi Meyers should be great. There's not a lot of competition for targets outside of Brock Bowers, who is operating as potentially a top tight end in the NFL. This quarterback position, Gardner Minshew, we know the case here. Now, Jakobi Meyers has given us some quality games. 3 straight games going into the bye week when he was not hurt with double-digit PPR points. But coming off the bye against Miami last week, 8.8, only 6 targets, hauls in 4 for 28, gets 1 rush for 20 yards. That was a tough matchup, but it gets even tougher against Denver. Denver right now is playing outstanding football. They rush the passer well. They don't let the passer get comfortable, and it forces the passer to make erratic throws. And that's what I expect this week out of Gardner Minshew. And if the quality of targets are not there for Jakobi Meyers, I do not see a world in which he is producing for our fantasy teams. Again, a lot of bye weeks this week. It's hard to sit some of these players with name value, but I think that's all Jakobi Meyers is right now, is name value, especially facing the Broncos. And I get it, the Broncos secondary, they've looked leaky in recent weeks. A couple of weeks ago, they went down a stretch where Cedric Wilson and Coker and Zay Flowers all went for over 17 PPR points. But in the past 2 games, they managed to shut down the Kansas City Chiefs. DeAndre Hopkins, 9.6 PPR points, led that team's wide receiver rooms. Ray McLeod last week, 10.6 PPR points, led the Falcons receiver room that also has Darnell Mooney and Drake London. You saw that they did not let Kirk Cousins get comfortable. And I think Gardner Minshew suffers a similar fate. We are sitting Jakobi Meyers in week 12.